In the beginning, imagine standing in an open, untouched wilderness, where the land stretches out in every direction. Endless forests, towering mountains, sparkling lakes, and rivers snaking their way across the land. The air is clear, crisp, and alive with the sounds of nature. An orchestra of birds singing, animals rustling in the underbrush, and the occasional roar of a river crashing against the rocks. This is the land that would become the United States. But 16,000 years ago, it was a vast, empty continent, untouched by human hands. The land was alive, but it wasn't yet a home to any human civilization. For most of us, the idea of an America without people is hard to fathom. We see cities bustling with life, roads stretching across the country, and people from all corners of the world. But it wasn't always this way. The story of America, like so many great stories, begins before it was America at all. It begins with a pristine wilderness, where nature reigned supreme. Back then, the land was vast, mysterious, and untouched. The air felt different, as though it carried the weight of millennia of evolution. Yet in these early days, the land was more than just a place. It was a canvas. It was waiting for something, waiting for life to arrive. The first human footprints would soon carve their way across the continent, forever changing the landscape of the New World. But who were these first people who arrived here? The first humans to step foot on what we now call North America didn't arrive in a single wave. They came over thousands of years, gradually crossing a land bridge known as Beringia. This bridge, which once connected what we now know as Siberia to Alaska, was a pathway for ancient hunters, families, and nomads. It was a migration that began at the very end of the Ice Age, around 16,000 years ago. These early travelers were likely in search of new hunting grounds, driven by the cold winds of the north and the endless opportunities for sustenance in a world full of gigantic mammals, like mammoths and mastodons. Their journey was long and dangerous, but it was also driven by an unrelenting human desire for survival and discovery. These early people were not simply wanderers. They were explorers, shaping the future of the land that would become America. Over the centuries, these early travelers dispersed, carving out distinct cultures across the North American continent. They became the first inhabitants of the land, the Native Americans, each group developing its own language, culture, and traditions that would later be woven into the complex fabric of America. In the Northeast, you had the Iroquois, a powerful confederacy of tribes who lived in what is now New York and parts of Canada. In the Southwest, the Navajo and Hopi thrived in the arid deserts, building intricate societies with art and culture. Along the plains, the Sioux and Cheyenne relied on bison, shaping their lives around the rhythm of these great herds. But this is where the story of America begins to get more complex. The arrival of these early peoples was not just the beginning of human history in North America, but the start of a long relationship between humans and their land. This land, wild and untamed, became not just a home, but a foundation for cultures, rituals, and beliefs that have withstood the test of time. For thousands of years, these early American societies flourished and adapted. The land was their source of everything: food, shelter, and the very fabric of their lives. But this delicate balance would be disrupted as the centuries passed, and the arrival of foreign explorers would mark the beginning of dramatic and devastating changes. The first known European explorers to encounter this land were the Vikings. In the year 1000, a group of Norse explorers, led by Leif Erikson, made their way across the North Atlantic and reached what is now Newfoundland. They didn't stay long, but their journey marks the first known contact between Europe and North America. Yet, despite the Vikings' brief presence, the land remained untouched for centuries after their departure. It would take more than 400 years for another European to set foot on North American soil. But when they did, they would bring with them not only curiosity, but also profound change. In 1492, Christopher Columbus, an Italian explorer sailing under the Spanish flag, crossed the Atlantic in search of a new route to Asia. Instead, he stumbled upon the Caribbean islands, marking the beginning of European exploration of the Americas. Columbus's arrival wasn't just a moment of discovery. It was the start of an era of European colonization that would forever alter the course of history. Spain, France, and England all sent explorers to claim parts of the New World, seeking riches, land, and glory. But what these European settlers brought with them was not just ambition, but diseases and new technologies that would devastate the native populations. For centuries, these first inhabitants of the land, the Native Americans, had lived in relative isolation, with little contact from the rest of the world. Their way of life was rooted in a deep connection to the land and the environment around them. They hunted, fished, farmed, and built entire civilizations based on a sustainable relationship with nature. But when the Europeans arrived, they brought with them diseases like smallpox, influenza, and measles, diseases that the Native Americans had no immunity to. These diseases, coupled with violence and forced displacement, decimated entire populations of indigenous people. The arrival of Europeans would forever change the landscape of America, not just physically, but culturally, socially, and politically. The impact of colonization on Native American societies is still felt today, with the legacy of displacement, broken treaties, and cultural loss lingering long after the first encounters. Yet, in the midst of this transformation, it's essential to recognize the incredible resilience and strength of Native American communities. Despite centuries of hardship, their cultures, languages, and traditions have survived and continue to thrive in many areas of the country. The Native American story is one of survival and adaptation, an ongoing journey of reclaiming their history and identity in a country that has so often overlooked or misunderstood their contributions. As we begin to look at the history of America, it's crucial to remember that the land wasn't simply empty before the arrival of Europeans. It was home to vibrant, diverse societies that had their own histories, challenges, and triumphs. Their story is as much a part of the history of the United States as the story of the colonists who arrived centuries later. This story of early America, of the land before people, and of the first peoples who called it home, sets the stage for everything that follows. It's a reminder that history is never just a single narrative. It's a complex, multifaceted story with many voices and perspectives, each contributing to the nation that would emerge from this land. As the centuries passed, the story of this land was no longer just about its wild, untouched beauty. The first peoples to walk across the rugged terrain of North America brought with them not only their hopes for survival, but the seeds of civilization itself. These early inhabitants didn't simply arrive as travelers. They were the first architects of this new world, shaping it in ways we're still discovering today. Imagine the scene. Small groups of people, walking along vast stretches of open land, their faces weathered by the elements, their bodies attuned to the rhythms of nature. They carried with them the tools of survival: stone-tipped spears, bone knives, and animal skins for warmth. They made their way across frozen land bridges, crossing from Asia into North America, likely following herds of mammoths, bison, and other megafauna. They were drawn by a common necessity: survival, but also a deep curiosity to explore and inhabit new lands. At first glance, this may seem like the story of nomads, wandering without purpose. But take a deeper look, and you'll realize that these early travelers were far more than wanderers. They were innovators, adapting to an ever-changing world, learning from their surroundings, and shaping their lives in ways that are only now being understood. They formed complex societies with intricate social structures, art, and spirituality, and lived in harmony with the land they called home. Over time, these early travelers spread across the continent, carving out different regions and ways of life. They were not one monolithic group, but a diverse collection of tribes, each with its own language, culture, and traditions. The Cherokee in the southeast, the Iroquois in the northeast, and the Sioux in the plains. These were just a few of the thousands of tribes that would come to define the rich tapestry of Native American life. They each had unique ways of living, from the agricultural societies of the Mississippians, who built large, complex earthen mounds, to the nomadic tribes who followed the migrations of bison across the Great Plains. For these first Americans, their land was more than just a place to live. It was sacred. Their spiritual beliefs were deeply intertwined with the natural world around them. They saw themselves as stewards of the earth, responsible for maintaining balance and harmony in all things. The rivers, mountains, and forests were more than physical landmarks. They were spiritual entities, imbued with meaning and significance. Life was not easy for the early peoples. The elements were harsh, and resources were often scarce. But there was a resilience in the way these societies adapted, evolving their methods of hunting, gathering, and farming to ensure their survival. They built settlements that ranged from small villages to large, bustling towns, each one an intricate web of relationships, traditions, and stories. The art of these early peoples, too, is a testament to their creativity and resilience. Cave paintings, pottery, and intricate beadwork tell the story of their lives, their beliefs, and their history. Each piece of art was not just decoration. It was a way of passing down knowledge, of telling stories that would live on long after the artist had passed. But these societies were not without their challenges. The climate was unpredictable, and the land itself was not always kind. Yet, through all the hardship, the Native American peoples persevered, developing technologies and traditions that would shape the future of the land for centuries to come. They developed tools that allowed them to hunt more effectively, and agriculture that allowed them to create surplus food stores, giving them the ability to settle in one place for longer periods of time. But perhaps the most significant aspect of these early American cultures was their ability to live in harmony with the land. Their relationship with nature was one of respect and balance. They understood the delicate interconnectedness of all life, a concept that has been lost in modern times, but was central to their way of being. The land was not simply something to be used. It was something to be revered, cared for, and preserved. As centuries passed, these societies flourished, and then, almost without warning, the world they had known for thousands of years was about to change forever. In the early 16th century, Europeans began to arrive on the shores of North America. bringing with them a new set of challenges. These new arrivals were driven by the promise of wealth, the desire for exploration, and the search for new lands to conquer. But they didn't understand the land or the people who lived there. The arrival of Europeans would prove to be a pivotal moment in the history of the Americas. For the Native Americans, it would mark the beginning of a period of immense upheaval, one that would bring about centuries of conflict, displacement, and struggle. The first encounters were not always violent, but misunderstandings and cultural differences were inevitable. The Europeans, unfamiliar with the customs, languages, and ways of life of the indigenous people, were quick to claim the land as their own. They built settlements and trade posts, and soon their presence would become an unstoppable force. The arrival of the Europeans, however, wasn't simply an invasion. It was the beginning of an exchange, a collision of cultures that would change the world forever. From this moment on, the history of America would no longer be the story of one people or one culture. It would become a story of conflict and collaboration, of survival and adaptation, of triumphs and tragedies that would echo throughout the ages. But before we rush ahead to the arrival of the Europeans, we must pause and consider the impact of these first Americans, their ways of life, and the societies they built. They were not a footnote in history. They were the architects of the land, the true first Americans. They lived, loved, fought, and thrived on this land long before the arrival of outsiders, and their legacy is still alive today. Their story is not one of defeat, but of resilience, of a culture that survived against all odds and continues to shape the United States of America in ways both seen and unseen. So, as we continue this journey through the history of America, let's remember these early peoples. Their story is as much a part of the nation's history as the founding fathers or the explorers who followed. They were the true first Americans, and their contributions to the land they inhabited will never be forgotten. The 16th century was a time of exploration, ambition, and uncertainty for Europe. The continents were in the midst of dramatic changes, driven by rising curiosity and a thirst for wealth, trade, and land. In the wake of the Renaissance, Europeans sought new routes to distant lands, driven by tales of unimaginable riches. The Americas, however, were more than just a land of potential treasure. They were the stage for one of history's most dramatic encounters, the meeting of two radically different worlds. In 1492, Christopher Columbus set sail, hoping to find a new route to India, but instead stumbling upon an entirely new world. What he discovered, however, was not just a land of riches, but a rich, complex landscape, already inhabited by diverse, thriving societies. For Columbus and those who followed, the Americas offered much more than just gold. They presented an opportunity to expand European influence and shape the destiny of nations. But while Columbus's voyages are often romanticized in history, the impact of his discovery was anything but glamorous for the indigenous people who had been living on the continent for thousands of years. The first interactions were marked by curiosity, mutual interest, and trade. The Native Americans, always eager to explore new possibilities, exchanged goods such as furs, food, and tools with the Europeans. It was an exciting time, filled with possibilities and hope. However, this initial cooperation would soon be overshadowed by the destructive power of European ambitions. The explorers who followed Columbus brought with them not only goods, but diseases, technologies, and ideas that would transform the Americas forever. smallpox, influenza, and measles would ravage Native American populations, wiping out entire tribes. The devastating effect of these diseases was compounded by the Europeans' quest for land, which led to conflicts and violent confrontations over territory. In the early 16th century, Spain and Portugal were the dominant European powers in exploration, with Spain claiming vast territories in the Americas. Spanish explorers, like Hernán Cortés, traveled to the heart of the Aztec Empire, ultimately conquering it with the help of superior weaponry and an alliance with rival indigenous groups. They plundered the empire for gold, silver, and other precious resources, initiating a centuries-long era of exploitation and colonization. Meanwhile, the French and English began their own voyages of discovery, competing for a share of the New World. The French, led by Jacques Cartier, established settlements in Canada and along the Mississippi River, while the English, driven by a desire to establish permanent colonies, began to settle in the region that would become the United States. Their goal was not just to find new land for trade, but to create a new society, one that was distinctly European, yet adapted to the challenges of the New World. The first English colony, Jamestown, was founded in Virginia in 1607. Life there was incredibly difficult. The settlers faced disease, hunger, and constant threats from indigenous tribes. The harsh realities of colonial life were far removed from the dreams of wealth and prosperity that many had been promised. Yet, they persevered, and their success in cultivating tobacco, an agricultural crop that was highly sought after in Europe, marked the beginning of a new era. Tobacco was the economic lifeblood of the colony, and soon, it began to shape the social and political landscape of the fledgling nation. It was also at this time that the first African slaves were brought to the Americas, marking a dark chapter in the history of the United States. The English colonists relied on the labor of enslaved people to fuel the tobacco economy, and thus began the systematic institution of slavery in the American colonies. The labor of enslaved Africans was integral to the survival and success of the colonies, yet it was built on a foundation of violence, exploitation, and human suffering. As more settlers arrived, the conflict between the Native Americans and European colonists became inevitable. While some native tribes attempted to cooperate with the newcomers, others saw them as a threat to their way of life and fought to protect their land. The Iroquois, the Powhatan, and the Wampanoag were just a few of the groups that found themselves engaged in increasingly hostile relations with the colonists. These conflicts would grow in scale and intensity over the coming centuries, with devastating consequences for the indigenous populations. One of the most famous and tragic encounters between Native Americans and European settlers was the story of Pocahontas. Pocahontas, the daughter of Powhatan, the chief of the Powhatan Confederacy, became a symbol of the possibility of cooperation between the two groups. She befriended the English settlers at Jamestown, and her relationship with Captain John Smith has been mythologized in American folklore. While the true details of her life are unclear, her marriage to John Rolfe, a tobacco planter, in 1614 marked one of the first efforts to bridge the gap between the English colonists and the indigenous people. But even as these efforts at diplomacy were taking place, the reality of colonization was becoming increasingly clear. The land was being taken from the Native Americans, and their cultures were being dismantled. The settlers' arrival had set in motion a chain of events that would change the Americas forever, transforming it into a land of conflict, struggle, and new beginnings. The clash of these two worlds, one old, one new, was just beginning. While European colonization in the Americas was driven by a variety of factors, economic opportunity, religious freedom, and the promise of land and riches, it was also marked by an insatiable desire for power and control. The Spanish, in particular, were determined to expand their empire, sending expeditions deep into the heart of South and Central America. The conquests of the Aztecs, Incas, and other powerful empires brought vast wealth to Spain, but at a tremendous cost. Millions of indigenous lives lost to war, disease, and forced labor. But what often gets overlooked in the story of European exploration is the incredible cultural exchange that began to unfold in the wake of these encounters. The Columbian Exchange, as it is now known, was a vast transfer of goods, ideas, crops, animals, and diseases between the Old World and the New. The Americas gave Europe foods like potatoes, tomatoes, and maize, staples that would go on to change European cuisine forever. Meanwhile, the Europeans brought horses, cattle, and wheat, transforming the agricultural landscape of the Americas. This exchange had lasting effects on the global economy and reshaped the cultural landscape of both worlds. But with all this exchange, the story of colonization is not one of simple progress. It's a story of devastation for the indigenous peoples who lived on the land long before the Europeans arrived. For them, the arrival of the settlers wasn't the beginning of a new world. It was the end of the world they had known. For the indigenous people, the world they had built over thousands of years was being ripped apart. Their land was taken, their way of life destroyed, and their people forced into conflict with the newcomers. What had begun as a small encounter, a meeting of different peoples, soon became a force that would sweep across the continent, leaving lasting scars on the land and its inhabitants. As we move forward through this story, we must never forget the impact that European arrival had on those who were already here. The Native Americans were not simply passive observers of history. They were active participants in their own story, shaping their world in ways that have had a lasting influence on the nation we know today. Their contributions, struggles, and resilience are woven into the fabric of America, and understanding their history is key to understanding the true story of this country. As the first English settlers established colonies along the eastern coast of North America, they quickly learned that survival was far from guaranteed. The dream of wealth, freedom, and a new life was tempered by the harsh realities of an unfamiliar land. Jamestown, Virginia, the first permanent English settlement, was founded in 1607, but its first years were a struggle for survival. The settlers faced disease, starvation, and constant threats from the surrounding Native American tribes. Despite their hardships, the English settlers persevered, driven by the desire to make a success of their new colony. But the true turning point came with the introduction of tobacco, a crop that would not only save Jamestown, but shape the future of the American colonies. Tobacco became the foundation of the Virginia economy. It was a lucrative cash crop in high demand in Europe, where smoking had become a fashionable pastime. The colony, once on the brink of failure, began to prosper as tobacco became its primary export. However, the rapid growth of tobacco cultivation required a workforce to tend to the fields, and the settlers turned to a solution that would have devastating consequences: slavery. By the early 17th century, the demand for labor to cultivate tobacco was growing, and the English colonists began to rely on enslaved Africans. In 1619, a group of African slaves arrived in Virginia, marking the beginning of a dark chapter in American history. While initially there were some attempts at indentured servitude, in which people worked for a set number of years in exchange for passage to the colonies, the shift toward slavery would prove to be a more permanent solution for the labor shortage. Over time, the institution of slavery became ingrained in the southern colonies, and it would continue to shape American society for centuries. Meanwhile, further north in New England, a different story was unfolding. In 1620, a group of English religious separatists, later known as the Pilgrims, arrived aboard the Mayflower, seeking freedom to practice their religion without the interference of the Church of England. They settled in Plymouth, Massachusetts, where they faced their own set of challenges. The Pilgrims, like the settlers in Jamestown, struggled against harsh winters, disease, and a lack of resources. But what set the Pilgrims apart was their relationship with the local Native American tribes. The Wampanoag people, led by Chief Massasoit, helped the Pilgrims survive by teaching them how to grow corn, fish, and hunt in the new land. This cooperation between the Pilgrims and the Native Americans is often mythologized in American culture, with the first Thanksgiving being celebrated as a symbol of unity and harmony. However, the reality of this relationship was much more complex. The Pilgrims and the Wampanoag had mutual interests, but their coexistence was ultimately overshadowed by the larger forces of colonization and the expansion of European settlements. The success of the Pilgrims in Plymouth led to the establishment of other Puritan colonies in New England, such as Massachusetts Bay Colony, Rhode Island, and Connecticut. These colonies were built on the idea of religious freedom, but they were not always tolerant of those who practiced different beliefs. While the Pilgrims sought freedom from religious persecution in England, their New World society was far from free from religious intolerance. The Puritans of Massachusetts Bay, for example, imposed strict religious codes, and dissenters such as Anne Hutchinson and Roger Williams were banished for questioning the authority of the church. As the 17th century unfolded, the English colonies continued to expand, and the settlement of North America took on a new urgency. The competition for land, resources, and influence between European powers, primarily England, France, and Spain, was heating up. The French, with their focus on fur trading, established colonies in Canada and along the Mississippi River. The Spanish, who had already conquered vast territories in South and Central America, continued to push northward, laying claim to the American Southwest and Florida. Meanwhile, the English expanded their holdings along the eastern seaboard, establishing a series of colonies that would eventually stretch from New England to Georgia. By the mid-1600s, the English had established a foothold along the Atlantic coast, but they were not alone. The Dutch had established New Amsterdam, later New York, and the French had their settlements in Quebec and Louisiana. The competition for land and resources led to numerous conflicts, both among the European powers and between the European settlers and the indigenous populations. The relationship between the English settlers and the Native Americans was fraught with tension and conflict. While there were periods of cooperation and trade, the European demand for land eventually led to violent clashes. The English settlers, eager to expand their colonies, encroached on Native American lands, leading to a series of wars and skirmishes. The most notable of these was King Philip's War, 1675-1678, a brutal conflict between the English settlers in New England and the Wampanoag tribe. led by Chief Metacom, also known as King Philip. The war was sparked by the growing pressure on Native American land and way of life. It was one of the bloodiest conflicts in American history, with thousands of lives lost on both sides, and it marked a significant turning point in the relationship between Native Americans and European settlers. Despite the violence and conflict, the English colonies continued to grow. By the late 17th century, the population of the colonies had risen dramatically, driven by waves of immigration from Europe. The English colonies were becoming more diverse, as settlers from various regions of Europe arrived in search of religious freedom, economic opportunity, and land. But as the colonies grew, so did tensions with the British government, particularly over issues of taxation, representation, and control. The colonial struggle was not just about survival in a new land. It was also about the growing sense of identity and self-determination among the settlers. The English colonists, while initially subject to the rule of the British monarchy, began to develop their own social, political, and economic systems. They were no longer just subjects of the crown. They were beginning to see themselves as something more, American. The seeds of rebellion were being sown. The English colonies, once dependent on Britain for protection, trade, and governance, were beginning to question their relationship with the mother country. The economic and social systems that had been put in place by the British were beginning to feel restrictive, and the settlers began to desire greater autonomy and self-rule. The idea of a new, independent society was beginning to take shape, but it would take decades of struggle and conflict before that dream would be realized. As the 17th century gave way to the 18th, the colonial struggle continued. The English colonies had established a firm foothold in North America, but they were still very much dependent on Britain. The question of who held the power, the British Crown or the colonial assemblies, was at the heart of the growing tensions that would eventually lead to the American Revolution. But that, as they say, is a story for another time. The colonial period was one of both hardship and triumph, of struggle and survival. The settlers faced obstacles that would have broken many, but they persevered. They built a new society from the ground up, one that was shaped by their desires for freedom, prosperity, and a better life. The history of these early colonies is a story of resilience, and it is this spirit of resilience that would carry the American people through the many challenges they would face in the centuries to come. In the early 17th century, when European powers were seeking new lands and wealth across the oceans, another story was unfolding along the windswept shores of New England. It was a tale of religious fervor, the pursuit of freedom, and a relentless desire to create a society based on personal beliefs. This was the journey of the Pilgrims, later known as the Pilgrim Fathers, and the Puritans who followed them. The Pilgrims, a group of English religious separatists, sought refuge from religious persecution in England. They were devout Protestants, a faction of the English Puritans who felt that the Church of England was still too much like the Catholic Church and needed more reform. They didn't just want religious freedom. They wanted a completely different way of practicing their faith, one that was free from the constraints of the English monarchy and the established church. The Pilgrims initially moved to the Netherlands in 1608, hoping to escape the religious restrictions imposed on them in England. However, life in the Netherlands proved to be difficult. The language and culture were foreign, and the fear of losing their English identity and faith eventually pushed them to look across the ocean. In 1620, they embarked on a perilous voyage aboard the Mayflower, seeking to establish a new home where they could worship freely. They landed in Plymouth, Massachusetts, where their journey of survival and creation would begin. What followed was not a story of instant success, but of perseverance in the face of unimaginable odds. The Pilgrims arrived in Plymouth in the harsh winter, with little food, inadequate shelter, and the relentless challenges of an unknown environment. Nearly half of them perished in the first few months. Yet, their story is often remembered for one shining moment of cooperation. The Wampanoag tribe, led by Chief Massasoit, formed an alliance with the settlers. Thanks to their guidance, the Pilgrims learned how to grow crops, hunt, and fish in the unfamiliar soil. This relationship culminated in the first Thanksgiving in 1621, a feast where the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag shared a meal in gratitude for the successful harvest. It's a beautiful image, one that we hold dear as a symbol of unity and cooperation. But it is, of course, only part of the broader picture of the relationships that would unfold between Native Americans and European settlers. While the Pilgrims were seeking religious freedom, their story, like many others in early American history, reveals the complexities of these early encounters. For one, the Pilgrims did not see the indigenous peoples as equals. They often viewed them as potential converts or obstacles to be overcome. The Wampanoag, who helped the settlers in the beginning, would later face pressures as the Pilgrims' numbers grew and as European-style settlement and land ownership began to alter the balance of power. In the decades that followed, a new wave of settlers, the Puritans, arrived in New England with a vision of creating a city upon a hill. The Puritans, unlike the Pilgrims, were not separatists, but reformers. They sought to purify the Church of England from within, and they were determined to create a society based on strict religious principles. In 1630, they established the Massachusetts Bay Colony, a colony where they hoped to build a perfect godly community, a place where both the church and the state worked together to enforce religious orthodoxy. The Puritans' vision was grand, but also rigid. They believed that the civil government and the church should be one and the same, and they created laws that would ensure everyone followed their strict religious and moral code. Dissent was not tolerated. People like Anne Hutchinson, who spoke out against the religious leaders and believed that individuals could have direct communion with God without needing the church's intermediaries, were banished from the colony. Roger Williams, another dissenter, would later be forced to leave Massachusetts Bay due to his belief in the separation of church and state, a principle that would become foundational to American democracy centuries later. But even as the Puritans created a society that was deeply religious and morally strict, they were also grappling with the complexities of living in the New World. The settlers faced constant pressures to survive in a harsh environment, raging winters, unpredictable crops, and a land that, while beautiful, was often unforgiving. It wasn't just the challenges of nature they had to contend with, but the challenge of establishing and maintaining their beliefs in a land far from the familiar institutions of England. The Puritans also had to wrestle with their relationship to the Native Americans. At first, like the Pilgrims, they formed temporary alliances with the indigenous peoples, learning from them and trading goods. However, as more settlers arrived and began to push westward, the relationship with the Native Americans became increasingly strained. The Puritans, much like the settlers before them, saw the land as something to be owned and cultivated, often ignoring the established ways of the indigenous peoples who had lived there for thousands of years. The belief that they were building a godly society sometimes blinded them to the injustices they were imposing on others. One of the most notable and tragic episodes of early American history occurred in 1675. King Philip's War. This conflict, named after Metacom, the Wampanoag chief also known as King Philip, was a desperate attempt by the Native American tribes in New England to resist the growing tide of English colonization. The war resulted in the deaths of thousands of people on both sides, but in the end, it led to the near-total destruction of the Wampanoag and many other tribes. This was the beginning of a long, painful period of land seizures, violence, and forced displacement for Native Americans, a story that would unfold repeatedly over the centuries. Yet, the Pilgrims and Puritans, despite their rigid faith and the conflicts they stirred, laid the foundations for what would eventually become the United States. Their quest for religious freedom, their establishment of laws based on moral codes, and their vision of a perfect society helped shape the ideals that would later be enshrined in the Constitution. Their story is not without its flaws. There were countless injustices, including the mistreatment of Native Americans and the institution of slavery. But it is also a story of resilience, survival, and the search for a better life. Today, the Pilgrims and Puritans are often mythologized in the American imagination, their stories simplified into symbols of freedom and perseverance. But when we dig deeper, we find a more complex legacy, one that includes both inspiration and tragedy. The legacy of the Pilgrims and Puritans is a reminder that the history of America is not one of perfect ideals, but of people who sought to build something meaningful amidst the imperfections of life. And in this pursuit, they laid the groundwork for a country that, despite its flaws, continues to strive for a more just and inclusive society. The 18th century began with a sense of prosperity and expansion for the American colonies. But it was not long before tensions began to simmer beneath the surface. What started as a distant, fragmented connection to Britain, a vast ocean between them, a monarchy a world away, soon evolved into a complicated relationship full of discord, frustration, and, eventually, revolution. By the 1700s, the 13 English colonies that dotted the eastern seaboard of North America were thriving. From the wealthy plantations of Virginia to the bustling port cities of New England, the colonies were rapidly growing in population, wealth, and influence. But with this success came increasing demands from Britain. The British government, still very much in control of colonial affairs, began to tighten its grip on the colonies, much to the displeasure of the colonists. One of the earliest signs of trouble came in the form of taxation. Britain had, over the years, become deeply entangled in wars across Europe, and by the mid-1700s, the country was financially strained. The British government, in its effort to recoup some of its war expenses, began to impose taxes on the colonies, taxes like the Sugar Act, 1764, and the Stamp Act, 1765. These taxes were designed to raise revenue from the colonies, but were met with an outcry. Colonists argued that they should not be taxed without their consent, a sentiment that would soon take root as a central theme in the American Revolution. The rallying cry of "No taxation without representation" echoed through the streets of colonial cities. The colonies had no voice in the British Parliament, and yet they were being taxed by it. For many colonists, this was an affront to their fundamental rights as English subjects. They felt that their rights to self-governance were being undermined by a distant government that had no understanding of their needs or concerns. But taxation was just one piece of the puzzle. Over time, the British government began to pass more laws that infringed on colonial autonomy. The Townshend Acts, 1767, which placed taxes on a variety of goods imported into the colonies, further fueled resentment. In response, the colonies began to unite in opposition, organizing boycotts of British goods and calling for the repeal of these oppressive laws. They began to realize that their grievances with Britain were not isolated incidents, but part of a broader pattern of control. The situation escalated in 1770 when British soldiers, stationed in Boston to enforce order, fired into a crowd of colonists, killing 5 people in what became known as the Boston Massacre. The event was widely publicized and used as propaganda by colonial leaders to rally support for the growing resistance movement. Tensions continued to rise, and in 1773, the British government passed the Tea Act, which granted the British East India Company a monopoly on tea imports to the colonies. This was seen not only as another tax, but as a symbol of British control over the colonies. In response to the Tea Act, a group of colonists, disguised as Native Americans, boarded British ships in Boston Harbor and dumped 342 chests of tea into the water, an act that would become known as the Boston Tea Party. This defiant gesture was a clear message to Britain. The colonies would no longer accept being treated as subjects of the crown. It was a bold act of rebellion, and it marked a turning point in the relationship between Britain and its American colonies. The British response was swift and severe. The government enacted the coercive acts, known in America as the Intolerable Acts, which closed Boston's port, revoked Massachusetts' charter, and sent more British troops to the colonies. These measures were intended to punish the colonists and reassert British control, but they only intensified the sense of injustice. Colonists in other colonies rallied to Boston's side, and the First Continental Congress convened in 1774, bringing together representatives from every colony to discuss their grievances and formulate a united response. By 1775, the situation had become untenable. In April of that year, British troops marched to Lexington and Concord to seize colonial arms and arrest leaders of the rebellion. But the colonial militias, forewarned, met the British soldiers in battle. The shot heard round the world was fired in Lexington, marking the beginning of the American Revolution. The first battles of the war were fought, and there was no turning back. What followed was a war of extraordinary resilience and sacrifice. The American colonies were far from prepared for war. The British military was one of the most powerful in the world, and the colonists were a ragtag group of militias, farmers, and tradesmen. But they had something the British didn't: a cause to fight for. The colonists, despite their lack of resources, had an unwavering belief in their right to self-governance, freedom, and independence. The war was not without its struggles. The Continental Army, led by General George Washington, faced enormous hardships. The soldiers endured brutal winters, with limited supplies and inadequate training. In the early years of the war, the American forces suffered a series of defeats, and morale was low. But the tide began to turn in 1777, when the American victory at the Battle of Saratoga convinced France to formally ally with the colonies, providing them with much-needed support in the form of troops, supplies, and naval assistance. The involvement of France was a game-changer. The French military presence on the side of the Americans forced the British to spread their resources thin. With the added support, the American forces gained critical victories, and by 1781, the British were finally cornered at Yorktown, Virginia. After a prolonged siege, British General Lord Cornwallis was forced to surrender, effectively ending the war. The Treaty of Paris, signed in 1783, formally recognized the United States as an independent nation. The British, exhausted from years of fighting, agreed to withdraw their troops from American soil, and the new country was free to govern itself. But the struggle for independence had come at a great cost. Thousands of soldiers and civilians had died, and the country was left with a fractured economy and a population scarred by years of war. But despite the hardships, the United States had achieved the impossible. They had defeated one of the greatest military powers in the world and had earned their place on the world stage as a free and independent nation. But the road to independence was not the end of the story. The newfound freedom presented new challenges: how to govern, how to create a nation that would stand the test of time. The United States would need to confront the issue of how to structure its government, how to unite diverse colonies into a single country, and how to build an economy that could support the ideals of freedom and liberty. The success of the Revolution was just the beginning of a new chapter in American history, one filled with new struggles, triumphs, and questions that would shape the future of the nation. The road to independence had been long and hard, but in the end, it was a story of victory, of a people who fought for their beliefs and achieved something no one thought possible. It was a story that would inspire not only the United States, but countless other nations around the world. And as the colonies transitioned into the United States, they would face the daunting task of defining what it truly meant to be free. As the revolution against Britain was ignited, the American colonies were faced with an overwhelming challenge. A fledgling nation, still in its infancy, had to grapple with the enormous task of building an army, securing international alliances, and maintaining unity among a diverse set of colonies. Yet, in the face of adversity, the struggle for independence became not just a military conflict, but a fight for a set of principles: freedom, equality, and the right to govern oneself. From the start, the American forces had significant disadvantages. The British Army was one of the most powerful military forces in the world, and they had a well-established supply chain and strategic infrastructure. The American rebels, on the other hand, were disorganized, underfunded, and faced constant challenges in terms of training and supplies. The Continental Army, led by General George Washington, struggled to maintain discipline and morale. The soldiers were not professional fighters. They were farmers, tradesmen, and ordinary citizens thrust into the chaos of war. One of the major turning points of the war came in 1776, a year that would define the future of the American colonies. It was in this year that the Second Continental Congress, convened in Philadelphia, took the historic step of declaring independence from Britain. The Declaration of Independence, written primarily by Thomas Jefferson, articulated a vision of a new nation based on the principles of liberty and self-governance. It was a bold proclamation, not only rejecting British rule, but asserting that all men are created equal, with unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The Declaration was revolutionary, both in its philosophical underpinnings and its implications. For the first time in modern history, a group of colonies declared their intention to form a nation where the power lay in the hands of the people, rather than a monarch or an aristocracy. The Declaration of Independence was a bold statement of ideals, but it also came with a heavy price. The American colonies had now officially become enemies of the British Crown. The war that followed was grueling and unpredictable. The early battles were a series of setbacks for the Continental Army, as Washington's forces were repeatedly defeated by the British. The most significant of these early defeats came in New York, where Washington's army was forced to retreat across the Delaware River. The prospects of victory seemed slim, and the war was teetering on the brink of collapse. But Washington, who had become the symbol of American resolve and resilience, refused to give up. It was during this time that his leadership would be put to the ultimate test. In December 1776, Washington launched a daring and unexpected attack on the British forces at Trenton, New Jersey, in one of the most famous military maneuvers in American history. Washington crossed the icy Delaware River on Christmas night and launched a surprise attack on the Hessian forces stationed in Trenton. The victory at the Battle of Trenton was not only a much-needed morale boost for the American forces, but it also proved that they could win against the seemingly invincible British Army. Washington's bold leadership and tactical brilliance inspired confidence in the Revolution and proved that the cause for independence was not a lost cause. The war continued to rage on, with victories and defeats on both sides. The Continental Army, despite its lack of experience and resources, was able to fight a long and grueling war of attrition. Meanwhile, the British found themselves stretched thin, unable to fully control the vast expanse of American territory. The British attempted to divide the colonies by isolating the New England region from the rest of the colonies. But they failed in this effort. The war was proving to be more difficult and costly than Britain had anticipated. It was during the winter of 1777-1778 that the war took another crucial turn. At the Battle of Saratoga in October 1777, American forces, under the command of General Horatio Gates, achieved a major victory against the British. The defeat of British General John Burgoyne's army marked a decisive turning point in the war. It convinced France, which had been providing covert support to the Americans, to openly ally with the United States. The French brought not only soldiers and supplies, but also a powerful navy, which would become crucial in the eventual defeat of the British. With the help of the French, the Americans were able to turn the tide of the war, but the cost of victory was high. The American army, struggling with a lack of supplies, faced the constant threat of desertion. The harsh winters, particularly the brutal winter at Valley Forge, tested the resolve of Washington's troops. Many soldiers died from disease, malnutrition, and the freezing cold. Yet, despite these hardships, the spirit of the Revolution remained unbroken. As the war continued, it became clear that Britain could not win the war through conventional military tactics. The British attempted to focus their efforts on the southern colonies, where they hoped to enlist loyalist support and break the will of the American rebels. The Southern Campaign led to a series of bloody battles, but the British were unable to secure a decisive victory. At the same time, Washington and his army continued to harass the British, launching strategic attacks and wearing down their forces. In 1781, after years of bloody fighting, the war reached its climax at the Battle of Yorktown in Virginia. With the help of French troops and naval support, Washington's forces surrounded British General Cornwallis's army at Yorktown, effectively trapping them. After weeks of siege, Cornwallis was forced to surrender, marking the end of the conflict. The British government, exhausted by the war, began negotiations for peace. The Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783, officially ending the war and recognizing the United States as an independent nation. The boundaries of the new nation were set from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River, and from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico. The victory was a triumph for the American cause, but it came at a tremendous cost. Thousands of lives were lost, and the war had left the colonies in economic ruin. The revolution, however, was not just a military victory. It was a victory of ideals. The United States had fought not only for independence, but for the right to determine its own future. The success of the American Revolution inspired revolutions around the world, from France to Latin America, and it set the stage for the establishment of a government based on the principles of liberty, equality, and self-rule. But even as the new nation celebrated its hard-won independence, questions loomed. How would this young nation govern itself? What kind of society would it become? The answers to these questions would shape the future of the United States. But the road to building a new government would prove just as difficult as the struggle for independence itself. For now, though, the colonies had achieved what seemed impossible. They had defeated the greatest military power in the world and carved out a new nation, born of the ideals of freedom and self-governance. The United States was free, but its journey was only just beginning. The United States had emerged victorious from the Revolutionary War. But with that victory came an enormous challenge: how to govern a new and fledgling country. The revolutionaries had won their independence, but now they had to figure out what kind of nation they wanted to build and how they would structure a government that would embody the ideals they had fought so hard to protect. The creation of a new government was as complex and contentious as the war itself, with deep philosophical debates about the balance of power, the role of the people, and the very nature of freedom. The immediate post-war years were marked by uncertainty and a sense of experimentation. The Articles of Confederation, the first Constitution of the United States, had been ratified in 1781, but it quickly became clear that this document was not enough to hold the newly formed nation together. The Articles created a weak central government, leaving most powers with the individual states. While this arrangement allowed the states a great deal of freedom, it also created a government that was ineffectual and unable to address the growing challenges facing the country. In 1786, as economic instability and civil unrest began to take root, highlighted by events like Shays' Rebellion, an uprising of farmers in Massachusetts protesting economic hardships, many leaders began to realize that the Articles of Confederation were deeply flawed. The inability of the government to maintain order and deal with the economic chaos demonstrated the need for a stronger central authority. As a result, a constitutional convention was called in Philadelphia in 1787, and the journey to create a new constitution began. The Constitutional Convention was attended by some of the brightest minds in the fledgling nation. Figures like George Washington, James Madison, Benjamin Franklin, and Alexander Hamilton. They knew that the stakes were high. What they were about to do would determine the future of the country, and the debates were intense. Should the United States be a republic, where power is vested in elected representatives, or a direct democracy, where the people themselves make the laws? How would power be distributed between the states and the central government? How could a government be structured in a way that would both protect individual freedoms and ensure order? One of the key debates revolved around the question of how to balance power between large and small states. The larger states, like Virginia and Pennsylvania, wanted representation based on population, while smaller states, like New Jersey, wanted equal representation, regardless of size. The Great Compromise, proposed by Roger Sherman of Connecticut, resulted in a bicameral legislature. One house, the House of Representatives, would be based on population, while the other, the Senate, would provide equal representation for each state, ensuring that smaller states would not be overpowered by the larger ones. The question of slavery also loomed large. The southern states, where slavery was integral to the economy, wanted to count enslaved people as part of the population for purposes of representation, while northern states, where slavery was less entrenched, opposed this. The compromise that emerged was the 3/5 compromise, which allowed states to count 3/5 of their enslaved populations for representation purposes. This compromise, while politically necessary at the time, would have long-lasting consequences, creating a system that enshrined the institution of slavery in the nation's laws. After months of intense debate and negotiation, the framers of the Constitution produced a document that was both a blueprint for government and a reflection of their philosophical ideals. The Constitution established a strong central government with checks and balances to prevent any one branch from becoming too powerful. It created a president, a Congress, and a judiciary, each with distinct powers and responsibilities. The Constitution also included provisions to protect individual rights, though the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments, would not be added until 1791. The new Constitution was a revolutionary document, one that created a government based on the consent of the governed and the rule of law. It enshrined the principles of liberty and democracy, but it also faced significant challenges. The Constitution was not universally embraced. Some feared it gave too much power to the federal government and would threaten individual freedoms. Others were concerned that it didn't do enough to protect the rights of ordinary citizens. The battle for ratification would be fierce. The Federalists, led by figures like Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay, argued that a strong central government was necessary to ensure the stability and success of the nation. They wrote a series of essays, known as the Federalist Papers, to persuade the public and the state legislatures to support the new Constitution. The Federalists were opposed by the Anti-Federalists, a group of leaders who feared that the Constitution gave too much power to the federal government at the expense of the states and individual rights. The ratification debates played out in the state legislatures and in the press, with passionate arguments on both sides. The outcome was not a foregone conclusion, and many states were deeply divided over the issue. But in the end, the Federalists succeeded. The Constitution was ratified by the required 9 states in 1788, and the new government was set to take shape. Yet, the struggle didn't end with ratification. The Bill of Rights, which would protect individual freedoms, such as freedom of speech, religion, and the press, was added in 1791 as a direct response to the concerns of the Anti-Federalists. The addition of the Bill of Rights helped to solidify support for the Constitution and ensured that the new government would be bound by limits that protected the rights of citizens. With the Constitution in place and the Bill of Rights safeguarding the freedoms of individuals, the new nation now faced the monumental task of putting the theory into practice. The first presidential election took place in 1789, and George Washington was elected as the first president of the United States. Washington's leadership was instrumental in guiding the fledgling country through its early years, as he set many of the precedents for the presidency that still exist today. But the road ahead was not without its challenges. The United States, now a republic, was still an experiment in governance. The new country had to navigate foreign threats, economic instability, and internal divisions. The creation of the nation had been a remarkable achievement, but the true test was yet to come. Would the United States be able to live up to the ideals upon which it was founded, or would it falter under the weight of its own contradictions? As Washington began his presidency, the United States faced the realities of a young nation, fragile, divided, and untested. Yet, the foundation had been laid. The Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and the precedents set by the first leaders of the nation would guide the country through its early years and shape its future. The struggle for independence had resulted in a new nation, but the real work of creating a just and lasting government was only just beginning. After the United States won its independence, the task of uniting the 13 colonies into a cohesive nation was just beginning. The victory in the American Revolution had created an opportunity for a new kind of government, but it also posed significant challenges. The newly formed country was composed of different regions, each with its own interests, traditions, and priorities. There was no common identity, no sense of unity beyond the shared experience of independence. How would the new government function? How could the young nation balance the interests of both the states and the central government? The first major test of the United States' unity came with the passage of the Constitution. The creation of a more centralized government had its critics. Many feared that too much power in the hands of the federal government would lead to tyranny. Much like the monarchy they had fought to escape. These concerns were addressed by the addition of the Bill of Rights, which guaranteed individual freedoms and limited the reach of federal authority. With the Constitution in place, the foundations for the American experiment in democracy had been established. But this experiment was still in its early stages. The federal government was weak at first, and there were ongoing struggles to establish the authority and stability of the nation. The country was economically unstable, with a national debt from the Revolutionary War and a lack of a strong financial system. The new government was still finding its footing, and the future of the United States was uncertain. One of the most important early figures in American history was Alexander Hamilton, the first Secretary of the Treasury. Hamilton was a passionate advocate for a strong federal government and a centralized economy. He recognized that in order for the United States to be economically viable and respected on the world stage, it needed a national bank and a unified financial system. His vision for a strong economic foundation included the federal government assuming state debts, establishing a national currency, and creating a system of taxation. These policies were not universally popular, but Hamilton's financial plan helped establish the economic stability that the nation desperately needed. Hamilton's policies were supported by President George Washington, who, after 2 terms in office, had become a symbol of unity for the country. Washington's leadership in the early years of the nation was indispensable. As the first president, he set many precedents, from establishing the presidential cabinet to stepping down after 2 terms, thereby reinforcing the idea of peaceful transitions of power. However, not everyone agreed with Hamilton's vision for the future of the nation. Thomas Jefferson, one of the founding fathers and the nation's 3rd president, had a very different view of the role of the federal government. Jefferson, along with his ally James Madison, championed the rights of states and was wary of a strong central government. Jefferson believed in a more agrarian society, where the federal government had limited power, and the people, particularly small farmers, were free to live without interference from distant authorities. This ideological divide between Hamilton and Jefferson would lay the groundwork for the development of America's first political parties, the Federalists, who supported a strong central government, and the Democratic Republicans, who supported states' rights and limited federal power. The formation of political parties in the 1790s was a sign that the political landscape of the United States was becoming more complex. The nation was no longer a unified front, but rather a place where differing ideas about government, economics, and society were beginning to take shape. This was the beginning of a political system that would be shaped by competition, disagreement, and compromise. The 1800 election, often referred to as the Revolution of 1800, marked a turning point in American politics. Jefferson, running as the candidate of the Democratic-Republican Party, defeated the incumbent President John Adams, a Federalist. Jefferson's victory was significant, not only because it was a peaceful transfer of power, but also because it represented the triumph of the principles of democracy and states' rights over the more centralized vision of the Federalists. The peaceful transition of power in the United States became a model for the world, proving that a government could function through democratic processes, even when the parties involved held radically different views. Once in office, Jefferson took steps to limit the power of the federal government, fulfilling his campaign promises. He reduced the size of the military, cut taxes, and sought to eliminate national debt. His administration also completed one of the most significant territorial expansions in American history, the Louisiana Purchase. In 1803, Jefferson negotiated with France to purchase the vast territory of Louisiana, doubling the size of the United States overnight. This acquisition opened up new opportunities for settlement and expansion, as Americans began moving westward across the continent. While the Louisiana Purchase was a huge win for the United States, it also highlighted the contradictions in Jefferson's vision for the country. Jefferson, a staunch advocate of limited government, had to wrestle with the fact that the purchase was not explicitly authorized by the Constitution. He justified it by arguing that it was in the best interest of the nation. But it was a decision that highlighted the tension between Jefferson's strict interpretation of the Constitution and the reality of governing a rapidly growing nation. The westward expansion that followed the Louisiana Purchase set the stage for America's manifest destiny, the belief that it was America's God-given right to expand across the North American continent, from the Atlantic to the Pacific. This idea would drive American policy and territorial acquisition throughout the 19th century, but it would also lead to conflicts with Native American tribes, as well as with other nations like Mexico and Britain. The United States expansion was not without its costs. As settlers moved westward, they displaced Native American tribes from their lands. The expansion of agriculture, driven by the rise of cotton plantations in the South, led to an increased demand for enslaved labor, further entrenching the institution of slavery in the southern states. The issues of slavery and westward expansion would come to a head in the 1850s, when debates over the extension of slavery into new territories and states intensified. The Missouri Compromise of 1820, which aimed to balance the number of slave and free states, was a temporary solution. But it only postponed the inevitable conflict that would erupt in the Civil War. The growth of the nation was also accompanied by the growth of cities and industrialization. The early 19th century saw the rise of factories, particularly in the north, where textile mills and ironworks began to reshape the economy. The expansion of the transportation network, particularly the construction of canals and railroads, facilitated the movement of goods and people, creating a more connected nation. The Industrial Revolution, which began in Europe, was beginning to make its way across the Atlantic, and it would forever change the face of the United States. But as the United States grew, so too did its divisions. The tension between the North and the South over slavery, economic interests, and political power was growing. The foundation for the coming conflict, the Civil War, was being laid during this period of rapid expansion and growth. The question of what kind of nation America would become was still unresolved, and the struggle to define that identity would continue to unfold in the decades to come. As the United States grew and expanded in the early 19th century, so too did the contradictions that underpinned its existence. The nation was founded on the principles of liberty, freedom, and the pursuit of happiness, ideals enshrined in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. Yet, these ideals were increasingly in conflict with the reality of slavery, a deeply entrenched institution that was integral to the economy and social order of the Southern states. The nation's growth was inextricably linked to the expansion of slavery, particularly with the rise of cotton as the South's most valuable commodity. The question of slavery was not new, but as the country expanded westward and new territories were added, it became a central issue that threatened to divide the nation. The invention of the cotton gin in 1793 by Eli Whitney made cotton production far more efficient, leading to an explosion in cotton cultivation in the South. Cotton quickly became the backbone of the Southern economy, and the demand for enslaved labor skyrocketed to meet the needs of cotton plantations. Slavery became not only an economic system, but also a deeply embedded social and political structure in the South. While the Southern economy thrived on cotton and slavery, the North took a different path. The northern states had largely abolished slavery by the early 19th century and had shifted toward industrialization and urbanization. The rise of factories and an increasingly diversified economy in the North led to a growing sense of sectionalism as the economic, social, and political interests of the North and South began to diverge. This divergence was further intensified by the question of whether slavery should be allowed to spread into the new territories acquired by the United States, such as the Louisiana Territory and lands won in the Mexican-American War. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 was the first major attempt to address the issue of slavery in the expanding nation. The compromise allowed Missouri to enter the Union as a slave state, while also admitting Maine as a free state, maintaining a balance between slave and free states. Additionally, it established the 36 Instig 30E line, a geographic boundary that prohibited slavery in territories north of that line, with the exception of Missouri. While the Missouri Compromise temporarily resolved the issue, it did not address the underlying divisions over slavery, and it became clear that the issue of slavery in the new territories was far from settled. The debate over slavery reached new heights in the 1850s, as the country was drawn into a series of intense political battles. The Compromise of 1850, designed to address the status of slavery in the newly acquired territories after the Mexican-American War, was another temporary solution. It allowed California to enter the Union as a free state, but also included the Fugitive Slave Act, which required that escaped slaves be returned to their owners, even if they had reached free states. The compromise also left the question of slavery in the territories of Utah and New Mexico to be decided by popular sovereignty, allowing the settlers in those territories to vote on whether to permit slavery. The Compromise of 1850 was a last-ditch effort to preserve the Union, but it only further polarized the nation. In the years that followed, the issue of slavery continued to dominate American politics. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which allowed for the possibility of slavery in the territories of Kansas and Nebraska through popular sovereignty, led to violent conflict in Kansas between pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers. This period, known as Bleeding Kansas, marked a new level of violence and hostility over the issue of slavery, as both sides fought for control of the territory. The violence in Kansas foreshadowed the coming conflict on a national scale. By the late 1850s, tensions between the North and South were reaching a breaking point. In 1857, the U.S. Supreme Court handed down the Dred Scott decision, which ruled that African Americans, whether free or enslaved, could not be citizens and had no legal standing to sue in federal court. The decision also declared that Congress had no power to prohibit slavery in the territories, effectively nullifying the Missouri Compromise and opening the door for the expansion of slavery into the Western territories. The ruling was a devastating blow to abolitionists and further entrenched the divide between the North and South. In the political arena, the election of 1860 was a turning point. The Republican Party, founded in the 1850s as an anti-slavery party, nominated Abraham Lincoln, who opposed the expansion of slavery into the territories. Lincoln's election was seen as a direct threat to the Southern way of life. In response, Southern states began to secede from the Union, forming the Confederate States of America. The secession of the South was a dramatic and irreversible step toward war, as the South believed that Lincoln's presidency would lead to the abolition of slavery and the destruction of their economy. The outbreak of the Civil War in 1861 was the culmination of decades of rising tensions over slavery, states' rights, and the future of the American Union. The war was fought not only over the issue of slavery, but also over the very identity of the nation. Would the United States remain a unified nation, or would it fracture into two separate entities, one based on slavery and the other on freedom? The Civil War would be the bloodiest conflict in American history, with over 600,000 lives lost. It would also redefine the nation, for better and for worse. The Civil War, which began in 1861, saw the Union Army, led by President Abraham Lincoln and General Ulysses S. Grant, face off against the Confederate Army, led by General Robert E. Lee. While the Confederacy fought to maintain its independence and preserve the institution of slavery, the Union fought to preserve the United States and to abolish slavery. Over the course of 4 years of brutal combat, the war would take a tremendous toll on both sides, leading to widespread destruction, the loss of life, and deep emotional and physical scars. The turning point of the war came in 1863 with the Battle of Gettysburg, a pivotal Union victory. In the aftermath of Gettysburg, President Lincoln delivered the Gettysburg Address, in which he reaffirmed the ideals of liberty and equality upon which the nation was founded. Lincoln's words, though brief, became a rallying cry for the Union and underscored the moral and political stakes of the war. He framed the conflict as a test of whether a nation founded on the principles of freedom could endure. In 1865, after years of brutal fighting, the Confederacy finally surrendered, marking the end of the Civil War. The Union had been preserved, and slavery, had been abolished with the passage of the 13th Amendment. However, the cost of the war was staggering. The United States had been torn apart, and the long process of reconstruction and healing would begin. Yet, even with the end of the war and the abolition of slavery, the issue of race and equality would continue to haunt the nation. The legacy of slavery was not so easily erased, and the fight for civil rights would continue for decades. The Reconstruction era, which sought to rebuild the South and integrate freed slaves into American society, was marred by resistance from the South, the rise of white supremacy, and the passage of discriminatory laws known as Black Codes. The end of Reconstruction in 1877 marked the beginning of the Jim Crow era, where racial segregation and disenfranchisement of African Americans became entrenched in Southern society. While the war and its aftermath reshaped the nation, the question of how to reconcile freedom, equality, and unity would remain at the heart of the American experience. The Civil War had settled the issue of slavery, but it had opened the door to new struggles over race, citizenship, and the true meaning of liberty in a divided nation. The Civil War ended in 1865, and with it, the Confederacy was defeated, and the institution of slavery was abolished. Yet, the road to rebuilding the nation, especially the southern states that had been the heart of the rebellion, was far from simple. The Reconstruction era that followed the war was a period of intense upheaval, filled with attempts to repair the damage caused by 4 years of brutal conflict and to redefine the role of African Americans in the nation. It was a time of monumental change, but also one of great resistance and profound challenges for the newly emancipated slaves and for the nation as a whole. In the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, the United States was a broken and fragmented country. The southern states had been left devastated by the war, economically, socially, and physically. Many southern cities and towns had been destroyed or severely damaged, and the South's economy, which had been built on agriculture and reliant on slave labor, was in shambles. The end of slavery left millions of newly freed African Americans with no land, no jobs, and few rights in the newly formed society. Reconstruction, as envisioned by the federal government, was an attempt to integrate the southern states back into the Union while ensuring that the rights of former slaves were protected. The primary focus was on rebuilding the South's political, social, and economic systems in a way that would allow African Americans to exercise their rights as free citizens, particularly through suffrage. However, this period would be marred by violent opposition from Southern whites, especially former Confederates, who sought to maintain their control over the region and undermine the progress being made. President Abraham Lincoln, who had overseen much of the war effort, had already laid out his plans for Reconstruction before his assassination in 1865. Lincoln's vision was one of forgiveness and reconciliation. He sought to reunify the nation by offering a lenient path back into the Union for the southern states. Under his plan, any southern state could rejoin the Union if 10% of its voters swore an oath of loyalty to the Union and accepted the end of slavery. This lenient approach, however, was short-lived, as Lincoln was succeeded by his vice president, Andrew Johnson, who lacked the political skill and vision to guide the country through the challenges of Reconstruction. Johnson's approach to Reconstruction, which was sympathetic to the South and lenient toward former Confederates, sparked a heated conflict with Congress. The Radical Republicans, a faction within Congress, believed that the South needed to be punished for its rebellion and that former slaves needed stronger protections to ensure their civil rights. They passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and later the 14th Amendment, which granted citizenship to all persons born or naturalized in the United States, including former slaves. They also passed the 15th Amendment, which guaranteed African American men the right to vote. However, despite these sweeping legal changes, the social reality of life for African Americans in the South remained grim. White Southern elites, many of whom had lost their economic power and status with the end of slavery, sought to reassert their dominance. They used tactics like sharecropping, a system where freed slaves and poor whites would rent land in exchange for a share of the crops, often leaving them trapped in cycles of debt. Meanwhile, white supremacy took root through groups like the Ku Klux Klan, which emerged during this period to terrorize African Americans and their allies. Violence, intimidation, and discrimination became a constant reality in the South, even as legal protections for African Americans were supposed to be in place. The federal government, under President Ulysses S. Grant, initially took a strong stance against this violence, passing the Enforcement Acts to suppress the Klan and protect African American civil rights. However, by the end of the 1870s, Northern resolve to continue Reconstruction waned. The economy was struggling, and many in the North were tired of the Southern question. In 1877, the Compromise of 1877 ended Reconstruction in exchange for a contested presidential election victory for Rutherford B. Hayes, who agreed to withdraw federal troops from the South. With the withdrawal of federal troops, Southern whites regained control of state governments. This marked the end of the Reconstruction era and the beginning of what would become known as the Jim Crow era, a period of legalized segregation and racial discrimination that lasted until the mid-20th century. The promises of Reconstruction, equality, freedom, and justice for African Americans were quickly rolled back in many parts of the South, and the reality of life for African Americans became even more restricted. Despite the failures of Reconstruction, the period laid the groundwork for the civil rights movements that would emerge later in the 20th century. It was during this era that African Americans began to build institutions of their own, churches, schools, and businesses that would become the backbone of Black culture and resistance in the years to come. As the country recovered from the war, the United States entered a new phase of its development, one that saw the rapid expansion of industry, the rise of powerful corporations, and the growth of cities. The late 19th century was an era of great transformation, but it was also a time of significant inequality. The Industrial Revolution, which had begun in Europe, took root in the United States, particularly in cities like New York, Chicago, and Pittsburgh. Railroads, factories, and steel mills reshaped the economy, and the country became one of the world's leading industrial powers. However, the benefits of industrialization were not shared equally. While a few wealthy industrialists, figures like Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller, and J.P. Morgan, amassed immense fortunes, most workers labored in difficult and often dangerous conditions. Labor unions began to form in response to these conditions, but they were met with violent opposition from business owners and government officials. The rise of monopolies and trusts led to widespread economic inequality, and the gap between the rich and the poor widened significantly. The urbanization that accompanied industrialization also brought about major social changes. Cities became centers of immigration, with millions of people from Europe and other parts of the world flocking to the United States in search of a better life. The promise of freedom, prosperity, and opportunity in the United States drew people from every corner of the globe, and by the turn of the century, the United States was home to a vast, diverse population. The rise of cities and industry also brought challenges. While the country was becoming more prosperous, many Americans were living in poverty, and the working class was growing restless. The conditions in the cities, crowded, unsanitary, and often unsafe, led to the development of the progressive movement, a reform movement that sought to address the problems caused by industrialization and urbanization. The progressive era, which spanned from the 1890s to the 1920s, sought to address the issues of labor rights, women's suffrage, child labor, and corruption in government. The battles fought during this era laid the groundwork for many of the social and political changes that would define the 20th century. But as the nation grappled with these issues, it also confronted new questions about its place in the world. The Spanish-American War in 1898 marked the United States' emergence as a global power, and the debates over imperialism and America's role on the world stage would continue to shape the nation's identity in the years to come. The post-war nation was one in transition, grappling with its past, building its future, and defining what it meant to be the United States of America. The struggles of Reconstruction had not been fully resolved, and the social, economic, and political divisions within the nation remained. But as the 19th century came to a close, the United States was on the cusp of becoming a true world power. The road ahead would be fraught with challenges, but the story of America was far from over. The late 19th century, often referred to as the Gilded Age, was a period marked by rapid industrialization, extreme wealth accumulation, and significant social inequality. The United States was emerging as a global economic power, but this prosperity was not experienced by all. The era was characterized by stark contrasts. While a handful of industrialists like Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller, and Cornelius Vanderbilt amassed immense fortunes, millions of working-class Americans struggled with poor working conditions, low wages, and inadequate living situations. The Gilded Age's name, coined by Mark Twain, encapsulated this duality: surface-level prosperity and deep, hidden poverty. The rise of industries, railroads, steel mills, and factories transformed the economy. But it came at a significant human cost. Laborers, including women and children, were subjected to grueling hours, unsafe conditions, and low pay. While corporations reaped enormous profits, workers had little to no rights or protections, leading to widespread exploitation. The situation worsened with the growth of monopolies and trusts, which gave immense control over industries to a small group of wealthy business magnates. The concentration of wealth in the hands of a few led to fierce debates over the distribution of resources and the role of government in regulating industry. Many workers and reformers began to demand change. Labor unions began to form to advocate for better conditions and higher wages. However, these unions often faced stiff opposition from employers, who were determined to maintain control and keep wages low. Strikes and protests became more frequent as workers fought for their rights, and in several instances, these protests were met with violent repression. One of the most significant labor movements was the Pullman Strike of 1894, which involved workers from the Pullman Company who protested wage cuts and high rents in the company town. The strike escalated, leading to nationwide railroad strikes that paralyzed transportation in the U.S. The government intervened with military force, leading to several deaths and raising questions about the government's role in suppressing labor unrest. The episode highlighted the growing tension between labor and capital, and the government's readiness to side with big business over workers. Amidst these struggles, social reform movements also gained momentum. The rise of progressivism, a political movement that sought to address the negative impacts of industrialization, was a direct response to the excesses of the Gilded Age. Progressives fought for labor rights, women's suffrage, better public health, and political reforms. They were also motivated by a desire to curb the power of big business, which they saw as a threat to democracy. Progressivism sought to expand the role of the federal government in regulating industry, protecting workers, and promoting social welfare. One of the key reforms that emerged from this period was the women's suffrage movement. Women across the country, including figures like Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Alice Paul, fought for the right to vote. This struggle was not an easy one, and it would take decades of protests, activism, and persistence to secure voting rights for women. The movement gained strength during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, as women began to play more prominent roles in public life and demanded equal rights under the law. In addition to women's rights, African Americans were also engaged in their own fight for civil rights during this period. While slavery had been abolished with the Civil War, the end of the conflict did not bring equality or freedom for African Americans in the South. Jim Crow laws, enacted after Reconstruction, institutionalized racial segregation and disenfranchised Black citizens, particularly in southern states. This period saw the rise of the Ku Klux Klan and other white supremacist organizations, who used violence and intimidation to maintain control over Black communities. Prominent African American leaders such as Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois had differing approaches to addressing these injustices. Washington advocated for vocational training and economic self-sufficiency as a means for African Americans to gradually gain respect and equality. Du Bois, on the other hand, believed in the importance of higher education and political activism to demand equal rights. The tension between these two philosophies would continue to shape the African American civil rights movement throughout the 20th century. Despite these ongoing challenges, the United States began to make strides toward modernity and progress. The Gilded Age and the subsequent progressive era saw the country undergo significant transformation, both socially and economically. New technologies, including the telegraph, the telephone, and the automobile, began to revolutionize communication and transportation, further connecting the nation. Meanwhile, the rise of mass media, including newspapers and magazines, helped foster a shared national culture. The turn of the century also saw the United States take its place on the world stage as a global power. In 1898, the United States fought and won the Spanish-American War, a brief conflict that resulted in the U.S. acquiring territories such as Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. This marked the beginning of American imperialism, as the United States began to assert its influence beyond its borders, particularly in the Pacific and Caribbean. However, the rise of imperialism also raised difficult questions about the nation's values and its role in the world. Should the United States, a country founded on the principles of liberty and self-determination, intervene in the affairs of other nations and establish colonies? The debate over American imperialism would continue into the 20th century, as the country navigated its newfound role as a world power. As the 20th century dawned, the United States faced new challenges and opportunities. The period of the Gilded Age, while characterized by inequality and corruption, also laid the foundation for many of the social reforms that would follow. The struggles of workers, women, and African Americans during this time would not only shape the future of the country, but also give rise to movements that would continue to fight for justice, equality, and freedom throughout the next century. The nation was evolving rapidly, moving from an agricultural economy to an industrial one, from a largely agrarian society to an urbanized and modern one. This rapid transformation created tensions between rich and poor, between races and classes, between old traditions and new ways of thinking. Yet, through all the challenges, one thing remained constant: the American spirit of resilience and the unyielding belief in the possibility of progress. As the century moved forward, these contradictions and struggles would give rise to new social, political, and cultural movements that would shape the course of American history. The Gilded Age was only one chapter in the unfolding story of the United States, a story of growth, conflict, and the ongoing pursuit of the ideals of liberty, equality, and justice for all. As the 20th century unfolded, the United States emerged from the Gilded Age and Progressive Era as a rapidly changing nation, one that had weathered both internal conflicts and external challenges. The nation's trajectory had been shaped by both the turmoil of industrialization and the triumphs of social reform. And as the country entered the 1900s, it was on the brink of becoming a modern global power. The world around it was changing as well, and the United States would soon find itself in the midst of global affairs, grappling with new roles, both at home and abroad. One of the defining features of the early 20th century was the rise of American imperialism. The Spanish-American War of 1898 marked the beginning of the United States' involvement in international conflicts that extended its reach far beyond its borders. The acquisition of territories such as Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines signified that the U.S. was now a force to be reckoned with on the world stage. But with this newfound power came questions about what it meant to be an empire and whether the U.S. should impose its values on other nations. The debates over imperialism would shape much of America's foreign policy for years to come. While the U.S. was grappling with its role as a global power, it was also undergoing significant transformation at home. The turn of the century saw the growth of urbanization, the rise of new technologies, and the expansion of the federal government's role in everyday life. The country was becoming more interconnected, both physically and socially. The spread of railroads and the telegraph made communication and transportation faster and more efficient. New technologies like the airplane, the automobile, and electricity began to revolutionize life as Americans knew it. As industries grew and cities expanded, the gap between rich and poor continued to widen. The rise of big business and the consolidation of corporate power led to new questions about the role of government in regulating the economy. The Progressive Era, which had begun in the late 19th century, continued into the 20th century, with reformers advocating for changes in everything from child labor laws to workplace safety regulations to women's suffrage. Social activists like Jane Addams, who founded the Hull House in Chicago, worked to improve conditions in cities, providing education, healthcare, and social services to immigrant communities. One of the most significant movements of the early 20th century was the push for women's suffrage. Women had been fighting for the right to vote for decades, and by the 1910s, their efforts had gained significant momentum. The suffrage movement was characterized by passionate activism, with women like Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Alice Paul leading the charge. Their work culminated in the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920, which granted women the right to vote. This victory was a monumental moment in American history and signified a significant step forward in the ongoing struggle for gender equality. As the country expanded both physically and socially, it also became more politically engaged. The early 20th century saw the rise of new political ideologies, particularly with the election of Theodore Roosevelt as president in 1901. Roosevelt, a Republican, was a progressive who believed in the power of the federal government to regulate business and protect workers. His presidency was marked by his Square Deal, a series of reforms aimed at addressing the excesses of industrial capitalism. Roosevelt championed the regulation of monopolies, the protection of natural resources, and the improvement of labor conditions. Meanwhile, in the South, the legacy of slavery continued to haunt the nation. Even though slavery had been abolished, African Americans in the South were subjected to Jim Crow laws that enforced racial segregation and disenfranchised black citizens. The rise of the Ku Klux Klan in the post-Reconstruction South marked a period of intense racial violence and intimidation. African Americans in the South were denied basic civil rights and were often subjected to lynching and other forms of violence. The early 20th century also saw the beginning of the Great Migration, as millions of African Americans moved from the rural South to the industrial North in search of better jobs, education, and social opportunities. This migration would help shape the cultural landscape of cities like Chicago, New York, and Detroit, and it would be a driving force behind the Harlem Renaissance of the 1920s, a cultural movement that celebrated African American music, literature, and art. Figures like Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, and Duke Ellington helped define a new cultural identity for African Americans, one that was unapologetically proud and distinct. The 1920s, known as the Roaring Twenties, was a period of cultural, economic, and social change. The decade was marked by a thriving economy, the rise of consumerism, and the growth of new forms of entertainment, such as radio, jazz music, and Hollywood films. The flapper became the symbol of women's newfound independence, as young women embraced new fashions, short haircuts, and a more liberated lifestyle. At the same time, the decade saw a backlash against these social changes. The rise of the Ku Klux Klan and the passage of Prohibition, which banned the sale and consumption of alcohol, were signs of the growing tensions between tradition and modernity. However, the economic prosperity of the 1920s came to an abrupt end with the onset of the Great Depression in 1929. The stock market crash of 1929 triggered a worldwide economic downturn that lasted for much of the 1930s. Unemployment soared, businesses failed, and millions of Americans were left homeless and hungry. The Great Depression exposed the weaknesses in the American economic system and forced the federal government to take unprecedented action. In response to the crisis, President Franklin D. Roosevelt launched the New Deal, a series of programs and policies aimed at providing relief to the unemployed, recovering the economy, and reforming the financial system to prevent future depressions. The New Deal included major public works projects, Social Security, and labor rights reforms. Roosevelt's leadership during this difficult time helped to restore faith in the American government and its ability to help ordinary people during times of crisis. The Great Depression also laid the groundwork for the United States' involvement in World War II. As the 1930s progressed, The global political landscape was changing. In Europe, Adolf Hitler rose to power in Germany, and in Asia, Japan began its imperialist expansion. The United States, under Roosevelt, initially sought to maintain neutrality in the face of growing international tensions. But as the war in Europe intensified, the U.S. began to shift its stance, providing aid to Britain and other allied nations. In 1941, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor brought the United States into World War II. The U.S. quickly mobilized its military and industrial resources, and by 1945, the country had played a decisive role in the defeat of both Germany and Japan. The war also brought about significant social changes in the U.S., as women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers to support the war effort, and African Americans fought in integrated units in the military, further pushing the boundaries of racial segregation. The aftermath of World War II saw the United States emerge as a superpower, both militarily and economically. The war had solidified America's place on the world stage, and the country's influence would continue to grow throughout the Cold War, as it faced off against the Soviet Union in a global ideological battle. The legacy of the 20th century, marked by wars, social movements, economic upheavals, and technological advances, set the stage for the challenges and triumphs of the 21st century. The story of the United States in the 20th century is a story of a nation struggling with its ideals and contradictions, while simultaneously pushing forward into the modern world. The nation was built on the principles of freedom and opportunity, yet its history is marked by struggles for civil rights, social justice, and economic equality. The challenges of the 20th century helped to define the identity of the United States and shaped its role in the world. While the future remains uncertain, the American spirit of resilience and the pursuit of progress continues to define the country's path forward.